excited that Warner's has provided this space and the ability for you guys to come and maybe learn something. It sounds like you all sort of have a general knowledge. So we're going to keep questions until the end, but I would like to introduce you. Does he need an introduction? Hardly. I'm Nancy. I'm married to Frank, and Frank and I have been in Flag for 30 years. And of course, you probably know that we owned the Cottage Place restaurant for 22 years. And he tried to do some gardening, but owning a restaurant is a full-time job. So it wasn't until we sold the restaurant now over 5 years, if you can believe that, it's been 5 years, that we really got into gardening. And we are truly a team. Frank is the brains, and I chop the rocks. But at any rate, composting has totally become a way of life for us. We don't even think twice about it. We collect vegetable matter, we go out and get vegetable matter, we go out and get other components of the compost. Now, if you ask me what's a green and what's a brown, I would go, I don't know. I think that the grass looks green and the something else looks brown. It's all too complicated for me. So he's really the composter, and I strain it. I'm a great strainer. So we are really, really happy to be here to share this with you today. And I'm very, very sorry about the lack of syllabuses. We will, it looks like everybody's pretty much here. So I'm going to pass around the sheet, and if you want a copy electronically of the syllabus, it's a PowerPoint, so I guess you have to have a computer or something. But I will send you a copy of that PowerPoint. This will also be on YouTube somewhere, on the Master Gardener's blog, I think, if you're smart enough to get to that. So, without further ado, we're going to put Frank right on and get him started.
I want to make it quick. I have to make my
yes. You have, Amy has some Master Gardener things to tell you about. Here's Amy.
Hi, my name is Amy Prince. I'm a volunteer with the Coconino Master Gardener Association. And forgive me if I read, I've just gotten this right here. So we just want to give Warner a big thank you for hosting this series of talks. Many of the lectures are sponsored by the Coconino Master Gardener Association between now and June. A lot of the classes are filling up, and we've actually been turning some people away. So please, if you want to be assured a seat, let Warners know they can put you on the reserve list, or send an email to through the Master Gardener Association website. Our association meets on the second Thursday of the month at Shepherd of the Hills Lutheran Church, and normally is also on Zoom. Open to the public. The lecture starts at 6:30 every time, and in April we have Jeff Wood talking about garden tools. And I just wanted to clarify that Coconino County Extension Office runs the training program for Master Gardeners, but the association is this group, and it kind of coordinates the volunteer opportunities and continuing education and things like that in our community. Upcoming events are May 21st from 10 to 2. There's a plant sale and garden festival at the Colton Community Gardens, which is an amazing place. If any of you haven't been there, it's just a really cool spot to check out. And then August 13th, 10 to 3 is the second annual vegetable garden tour. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Amy. Not no drop the mic thing. Pull that compost bin back, I can catch the lid. So, composting, or turning kitchen waste and garden waste into black gold. Composting is just a magical thing. We take our things that have no value, wilted food, the garden trimmings, grass clippings, pine needles, leaves, and turn it into a great soil amendment that has real value. I mean, you can pay $20 to $30 a bag for a bag of a soil amendment that has anywhere near the same nutrient and living organisms that we get from compost. So it's a great way to recycle organic matter. We waste a lot of the food that we grow here in the United States, about 40%. Ever seen a real celery plant in the field? It's like this big, and then we get to the store, they're like this big. in the field, they chop off the outside stalks and just leave them in the field. And they do get plowed in. Okay, they do get plowed in, but there is a lot of waste. And then we also waste about 40% of what we buy because things go to date or because they get a little too wilted. And so that's a good place to recycle some of that food waste. And I do go to the food bank and collect some of the leftover food. They get a bunch of food sent to them. It's really pristine when they get there, but it's more than they can give out. Eventually some of it gets pretty wilted and they put it outside. And the food bank is part of Flagstaff Family Food Center, and it's at 3805 East Huntington. So what is compost? It's a rich soil-like material. Oh, geez. I thought my voice carried better than that. It's a rich soil-like material. It's not soil, because soil is 95% minerals, and this is all organic matter. It's full of microorganisms that really help to build the soil and will help the plants to absorb the nutrients. And great way to add both the organic matter and the beneficial microorganisms to your soil. What happens during compost? Aerobic or oxygen-loving microorganisms consume organic matter and produce this rich soil-like material. And while they're doing that, they release enzymes. Those enzymes then create chemical reactions, and that's what causes the compost to heat up. And as it heats up, a different group of bacteria, thermophilic bacteria, take over, and they can keep it at 155 to 180 if you have enough nitrogen. What are these critters? Well, there's bacteria, fungus, nematodes, mites, and if I can say this, actinomycetes. And that is a critter that is part bacteria, similar to bacteria and fungus at the same time. And those are the critters that give the compost that nice earthy smell. And I practiced that. There's also, of course, larger critters that can help, worms, certain insects, and really important to keep good airflow. People were talking about not being able to heat up their compost. Airflow is one of those. I have a couple of tricks for that. I have a little diagram which I'm not going to go into. It just is a simple, shows you how composting works. Where do the microorganisms come from? The air, the water, and the soil. So it's really good if your compost is in contact with the soil. Some of these compost bins are open on the bottom. And you can also add some more microorganisms. If you're having trouble getting it to heat up, I've used this in the past. I now just use my compost from a previous batch, but it basically makes a compost tea. It's made out of worm castings. I think it's very safe for food plants. And then they also have some other microbe additions that can help to increase the number of microbes to get your compost started. Once you've got a good batch that's heated up, you can save some of that compost and put it into the next, into your next batch. I'm planning on making a compost pile. We may not get to everything, but if, and when I do, we're gonna add some compost to it and some other things. What are the benefits of composting? For one thing, it's great exercise. The age-old question, should I go to the gym today or should I just go turn the compost? It's a good workout. I always have 2 of these bins going, and if I turn them both on the same day, I'm ready for a beer and call it a day. It enriches your soil with, great nutrients. You can cut down on the amount of chemical fertilizers you need. You can introduce beneficial bacteria and fungi to help break down your soil matter. It can help actually suppress plant diseases and pests, and it's helping to take things out of the landfill, which would otherwise produce greenhouse gases. I'm going to talk a little bit about 3 stages of organic matter. The first is what we know, fresh vegetables that are in our refrigerator. And those are full of nutrients, but they're not in a form that plants could absorb. As we put them into compost and they start to break down, and they'll still be recognizable, they'll still have too much fresh nitrogen where they could cause your soil to heat up if you were to put them out in your soil too fast. But over time, once they've stopped being recognizable, turned black to gray, pretty much nothing left in there recognizable, then it's a pretty good chance that they're completely broken down into active organic matter. But they still have enough nitrogen and other nutrients that they'll help your plants. But to be sure you don't have any fresh nitrogen, it's not a bad idea to take some of that compost, put it in a Ziploc bag, seal it up, let it sit for a few days, and see if it starts to smell like ammonia. Because then it's gone anaerobic and there's still too much fresh nitrogen. But if it doesn't, then you have active organic matter, which is good for feeding your plants while at the same time providing, the microorganisms. The next stage is called passive organic matter, or as we call it, humus. Humus is and we pronounce these two words interchangeably, but humus is the passive organic matter. Humus is a spread you made out of garbanzo beans and tahini. It's great on bagel chips, but not so good in your soil.
Don't mix them up.
Yeah, don't mix them up. Yeah, don't. But and humus is like fully broken down, so it doesn't provide the plant any food any longer, but it has a lot of really positive benefits for your soil, and it lasts for years and years, maybe 100 years. And it helps to retain moisture, helps to retain the microorganisms, it helps to retain some other nutrients. It does still have some micronutrients. And for long-term successful gardening, building up the amount of humus in your soil will help reduce the workload, because active compost, active organic matter breaks down in a year. So I did that for 8 years or so. I was putting in active organic matter, it's breaking down, and the next year I have to do it all over again. If you have more humus, then your compost will last. The benefits of your compost will last longer. See if there's any of this we didn't cover. And organic matter helps to create soil structure. You want your soil to be kind of crumbly, and the microorganisms and the organic matter work together to make little aggregates of soil, and that really helps your soil to drain. It helps to create air spaces so your plants can get, and your microorganisms can get air, and it allows the soil to drain. There was a story I heard about an organic farm. You remember when the Midwest flooded really badly two or three springs ago, and kept seeing these pictures and the fields were all like lakes. But when you flew over this organic farm, it didn't flood because they had really good soil structure and the water passed straight through. And this is like the last 2 years, I'm starting to get pretty good soil structure after years of adding organic matter. An important part of that too is to mulch your soil in the winter. We're so dry here that if you leave your soil exposed in the winter, that the top dries out, the worms disappear, and you lose some of your soil structure. So it's really helpful if you've got good organic matter. I mulch with pine needles, and then I compost them in the spring. So let's talk about the steps we're going to go through to make compost. I know this is kind of review for a lot of you, but we'll try to cover some of this stuff kind of quickly. First, we've got to choose our materials. We need a combination of browns and greens. Browns being high carbon organic matter, greens being high nitrogen organic matter. And we're going to go through that in a bit of detail. Second step is selecting a container and a location. Location, they say in the restaurant business. I didn't follow that advice. I picked a little out of the way spot. But for composting, you want full sun. It's almost more important to get full sun for your compost than it is for your plants, because our sun is really hot and sometimes too much for the plants. Especially helps in the winter, and you also probably want to figure out a way to locate it for aesthetics, for not too close to your house, not too far away, and not by the neighbor who always complains. Provide proper ventilation, really important, both for it to heat up and to keep it from smelling. We want aerobic bacteria. We've got more to talk about that. Maintain proper moisture. They always say damp is a wet sponge. I don't know what that means. You know, there's nothing like compost and a wet sponge have nothing in common really. But we'll talk about what we want to look for. You want the ingredients to be wet, but you still want to have air spaces in between. If you do too much water, it consolidates into one big mass, and again, it'll go anaerobic. Maintain the desired temperature, not too much. This is my old compost thermometer. They have one here for sale. It's really helpful. This is another way to do it. Stick your hand in the middle of the pile and see if it feels hot. It works pretty well. But if you're trying to really heat it up to the point where you can kill insect larvae and pathogens, you probably want a thermometer because you want to try to keep it like 135 for about a month in order to kill things. Curing. That's a process that really only affects hot composting. Curing is letting it cool down. Well, it will start to cool down when it gets to a certain level of doneness, and then you kind of let it cool down a little bit more. But the cooler, then you let it go through a period of cool composting, which allows fungus and worms and other things that wouldn't like the higher temperatures to do their work. And fungus, we're discovering, is almost more important than the bacteria because it's really important for developing soil structure. And then straining is a good way to do it. If you strain it, you know, it comes out looking like the stuff that comes in a bag. I mean, basically, mine's a little coarse when I get done, a few sticks, a few rocks. You pick that stuff out, you strain it, you get pretty nice fluffy compost. And then the stuff that you didn't go through the strainer, you can still use that for mulch. Put it around your fruit trees or something. It's still got a lot of nutrients in it. It's just maybe not something you want to be planting in. Okay, creating a carbon and nitrogen balance for your compost. So all organic matter has a carbon-nitrogen ratio. Carbon is always the first number. Nitrogen is always the second number. Nitrogen is always expressed as 1. So both browns and greens have more carbon than they do nitrogen. I did not understand that when I started composting.
I still don't.
So the ideal carbon-nitrogen ratio for compost would be about 30 to 1. And high carbon browns can range from 60 to 400 to 1. And then high nitrogen greens range from like 7 to 1 to 40 to 1. So as a result, there's a huge difference in the amount of carbon that can go into it. So when you combine those two things, you're going to choose your browns and your greens and combine them. You're going to be averaging those two things. But the averaging doesn't work because you need to know the mass, you need to know the water content, you need to be able to estimate how long does it take for wood chips to break down compared to a zucchini. The zucchinis are in 5 days, the wood chips are 2 years or something. So that's where it kind of becomes an art. You can't actually do it mathematically unless you have a degree in biochemistry. So you kind of develop a sense of what you need to be mixing together. And because I was very concerned about heating up my compost for a long time, I was kind of discouraging people from using wood chips. 400 to 1 for wood chips. And they take 2 years to break down. But there's some other benefits to wood chips, and that is that they help to grow some very beneficial fungus, and they help to create humus. So there are some good benefits to using wood chips, but I wouldn't count on it as your main source of brown. I would use it as a small amount of your brown, and then there are other things that are woody that will do the same thing, like asparagus stems, and I like eating asparagus, and I grow asparagus, and rye stems. And rye grows pretty well here as a grain. So growing rye as a cover crop, the stems have a woody nature to them it's a material called lignin, which is what wood is kind of made of, and that is really good, beneficial for growing some good fungus. Cardboard works pretty well. You know, the corrugation, and it's better if you shred it, but you can just put it in, I put it on the bottom, I put it in layers. It still breaks down and provides a little airflow. I don't know about sawdust from carpentry. I'm concerned that kind of sawdust would have some chemicals added to it to keep the stuff from turning green, and I have some confirmation there. Newspaper, good food for thought. Not great food for plants, but the carbon but it does have a lot of carbon, for composting. And you know, newspaper takes longer to break down than cardboard. But it is, and the newspaper here in town is good for compost. They use a good ink. Try to avoid the big colorful pages, but straw is really kind of a favorite for me because it's hollow. It helps to keep the pile fluffed up, keep airflow, which will help you with your heating up. And it breaks down fairly quickly. Deciduous leaves break down almost instantly. So I like those as a source of carbon. Pine straw, we are going to have a special section on pine straw. I compost pine straw. It's kind of a love-hate relationship. It takes a little extra work. Most of the things people say about pine straw are misinformation. But
what is pine straw?
pine straw, pine needles.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, that's what we call them in the South, I think. So some nitrogen-rich materials. You know, garden waste is really good, especially in the fall. Be sure you avoid anything that has insect infestation or powdery mildew or any signs of disease. Alfalfa hay, most people think it's the same as straw, but alfalfa hay is high protein, rich in nitrogen. I use it to heat up my compost. It's a little more expensive, but it's a really dependable source of nitrogen. Food waste, I get a lot from the food bank. I've been known to take home as much as 300 pounds of food from the food bank. They have a special place for farm food, they call it. So you're not taking food away from people. It's stuff that's too bad for them to give out, or people just won't take it anymore. And a lot of the time nowadays, they put it outside. Yesterday, 2 days ago, I went by, they had a whole pallet, 60 cases of chard. It was way wilted and chard's great, I think, for compost. They also had tomatoes. Anything like tomatoes, you have to cut them in half at least. If you leave them whole, you know how tomatoes germinate? You have the seeds, that gel around the seeds in the tomato retards germination. And so you ferment that in a jar, usually at home, when you're saving seeds. But if you put a whole tomato in your compost pile, that stuff will ferment in the compost pile and the seeds will germinate, and you put the compost out in your garden and it looks like a lawn of tomato plants. So cherry tomatoes are not very useful because you would have to cut each one in half to expose the seeds. Coffee grounds in Starbucks, other coffee shops, they put out these little silver bags. I pick up tons of coffee grounds from Starbucks. Good source of nitrogen, never goes anaerobic, never smells, and I think it's a really good source. People say it's acidic. The truth of the matter is when you brew the coffee, the grounds lose their acidity. So it's probably not going to help your acidity, but it's still really rich in nitrogen. Grass clippings, though not many people have lawns anymore, but grass clippings work. They're a good source of nitrogen. Beer mash or spent grains, really good at heating up compost. Most of the breweries have a contract with somebody that it's also really good for feeding pigs. And so it's a little hard to get now. I had a guy who was giving it to me, but you know, I think he ended up making a contract with another rancher. So, but if you can get it, or if you brew your own beer, that could be a good reason to start brewing beer. Manure, you know, I don't use manure because I was a chef for 35 years and the health department was like, don't touch fecal matter. And so it's kind of like I'm a little wimpy about that. It's good at heating up compost, especially if you have your own livestock animals and you put straw down and then you pick up the manure and the straw and then you let it age a little bit, and that's a good way to start compost. I say people that have chickens think that it's really easy to heat up compost, and people that don't have chickens think it's a lot harder to heat up compost because that stuff works really well. But also, if you use manure, you're kind of increasing the chance for pathogens in your compost. And if you get it from somebody else, they could be bringing in weed seeds from somewhere else. Just something to think about. Again, the food bank is on 3805 East Huntington, which is just south of the railroad tracks off of Industrial. So wood chips are really good for helping to create some really healthy fungus. You ever picked up a rotten board and there was this long stream of white fungus underneath it? That's the same, that stuff helps to build your soil. So if you want to do no-till gardening, that kind of fungus is really helpful. And then woody materials are kind of the foundation of humus. Oh, well, we'll talk about that later. An example of combining browns and greens. So if we use straw, which is 75 to 1, and vegetables that are 25 to 1, and you're going to combine them in a 2 to 1 ratio, 2 browns to 1 green. Not everybody does it that way, but that's pretty much the most common. For one thing, the browns help keep you fluffy, help keep airflow, and also, again, they help with the formation of humus in the end. And so if you do those, if you combine 2 straws and 1 vegetable matter at 25 to 1, you'll come out about 55 to 1, which would be way above what you're looking for. So how do you fix that? This, all the people that are trying to warm up your compost, you need to add a hot green. And one of those is beer mash. But you do need quite a bit of beer mash. Another way, which is not too expensive, is cornmeal. Just the 5-pound bags, they go on sale for about $3.99. You know, maybe a couple of pounds into a batch of compost. And it's very rich in nitrogen and helps quite a bit to heat it up. Alfalfa meal, really cheap. You can buy it as rabbit food, maybe $6 a bag for a 25-pound bag or something. Keep in mind, anything, manure, animal food, anything that's associated with animals has a little bit of salt in it. So you could have a problem if you keep using. Cornmeal doesn't have any salt in it, well, other what's maybe naturally occurring. Blood meal, kind of an expensive choice, sold as a nitrogen additive for your garden. It's about $20 for a 2-pound bag. Super high in nitrogen though. Livestock manure is another. And one I've ended up going with after I lost my connection for beer mash was alfalfa hay. And I mix that in, well, I'll show you. I'm going to make a compost pile here, and I'll show you how. I just kind of mix it in as maybe a third of my green matter. And it comes in a compressed, we can get it in a compressed bale for about $18 at Tractor Supply, or you can get a bigger bale at Olson's. But if you put a bale in a enclosed car, it gets everywhere. If you have a pickup truck, that's fine. I tried, and I mean, it's everywhere. So those are some examples. So hot composting versus cold composting or cool composting. So most people in America do cool composting. I don't know if that's because they tried to do hot composting and it didn't get hot, but I think it's probably because of the amount of time people have, and people in America work a lot. So the differences are, hot compost is going to be 110 to 155 or more. It breaks down faster. It requires more nitrogen and oxygen, as we've said. You need to turn it more often, like once a week or once every 10 days. And it can destroy weed seeds, pathogens, and insect larvae. But it is a challenge to do that because you need to keep it up around 135 for like a month. And the reason that's a challenge is as more of that fresh nitrogen material breaks down into the active nitrogen, but no longer has fresh nitrogen to feed, the thermophilic bacteria, it naturally starts to cool down. So, it might cool down for a day and then you turn it and if when you get your packets, there's a thing called the life and times of a compost pile, and it kind of explains how you layer your compost, it breaks down and shrinks, and starts to cool down. You turn it, add more nitrogen and more fresh material to it, breaks down. So you might cool down for a day or so through that month here and there, but you basically keep it moving. Cool compost runs more like 85 to 105. You still want it to feel warm, because if it's not warm at all, then you're probably not composting. You're probably just, it's just sitting there. I'll tell you a story about that. It still turns out needs to be turned occasionally, but not nearly as often. And you know, it's an option for a lot of people just because of the amount of time we have. A few things not to compost. Pet waste is one. Fish, meat, fats, and grease. Yard trimmings that are treated with pesticides. I mentioned grass is a good source of nitrogen. I still think that Flag Ranches is doing their golf course organically and not using pesticides, but you could ask, and they wanted to get rid of their grass clippings. Probably early in the season is better than once it starts to put out seeds. Any plant that has diseases, dairy products, eggs. A little bit controversial, I think, is ashes from your wood stove. Some people say it's okay. We've been, and master gardeners in Arizona have been saying no, and the main reason I understand is because they are alkaline, and our soil tends to be alkaline. If you happen to live somewhere in Flagstaff that happens to have more acidic soil, then it might be fine. But there is a variation on the ashes, which is called biochar. And biochar is like a new hot topic. It's wood that's cooked in a vacuum. And because it's cooked in a vacuum, you know, it stays black, it doesn't get any gray, and apparently it creates a really good environment for the microorganisms. And you can look it up online and pay $20 for a little bag, or you can go to Safeway and they have Diablo natural lump charcoal and crush that up, and it's not easy to crush, but you can run over with your car or something. And use it, and you don't add a lot. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to give it a try. But you can look it up online, and you'll find a bunch of suggestions about how to use biochar. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question. I know you said no eggs. What about the eggshells? My mom's worried about it.
Eggshells are fine for compost. In northern Arizona, our soil is kind of alkaline, and eggshells are alkaline, but it still could be worthwhile because they're also full of calcium. And tomatoes here need calcium, even though my yard is full of limestone, which is calcium carbonate. The plants don't get enough calcium unless I add it. So it's a matter of personal preference. It's a good question.
How much cornmeal did you say to add to the compost?
Well, I would add it until it heats up. I would say at least a pound for like one of these bins when you're starting it out, and maybe 2 pounds. That would be about $2 worth or something, and that would probably be plenty. But a pound might not be enough. I haven't done it for a while because I did do it a good bit for a long time, but I haven't lately. So let's talk about bins. We talked about location. This thing on the far left, Nancy, she's the Vanna White. She's going to walk across the stage with various things here. And so this first one we're going to talk about is called an earth machine. We got this at a Earth Day celebration about 20 years ago. And it's open on the bottom. It has really good vents all the way around. They break in half to make it a little bit easier to turn the compost, but after a while they don't stay back together anymore. So that's why I screwed it together. I tried using this one idea, but I've never taken it apart. Well, I just take it apart when I want to, and it just stays together. This is one they sell at Warner's. It's a pretty similar idea, being open on the bottom, but it doesn't have any vents, and I'm not sure if they've got mist, but I still think it's really nice and heavy duty. I would still buy one, but I would just take my half-inch drill bit and just drill about 60 holes in it. Take about a second, pop right through it, and then it'll have plenty of air vents. And so that's one thing. Oh, they recommend a cubic yard for a standard compost bin because it's so big that the outside would help to insulate the inside. The problem is, this is about a third of a cubic yard, and it takes about 12 5-gallon buckets of organic matter to fill it. So for most of us to come up with a cubic yard, 3 times as much of that would be 36 5-gallon buckets or something. That's a big task. So I think if you have a ranch or a farm, you have a lot of straw and manure, or you're cutting down whole fields of corn, then I think a cubic yard is a good idea. For the rest of us, we kind of have to compensate with other methods, turning it more often, using other tricks to keep it hot without having it to be so big. If you have a packet, if anybody else who doesn't have a packet, if you have a packet, could you hold up the picture of the 3-compartment bin for other people to see? It is page number 15. And this is something that one of the master gardeners built. It's 3 1 cubic yard compost bins side by side. And the idea is that you build a bin, you have a compost pile, you get ready to build a second one, you move it 1 step to the right, build your new one, get ready to build the next one, you move everything 1 step to the right again. By that time, the 3rd bin is done. I think it's great. I think for most of us, you can see they're not very full because a cubic yard is a lot of compost. Another one that, so there's also the tumbler style. And you'll see these in various places where you have a horizontal bin and it rotates on an axis, and that's supposed to be an easier way to turn compost. I think on small scale, it can work. This is one made out of a trash can. I've now discovered it's not enough holes, and you need more than a bungee cord to hold the top on, because as you roll it, compost gets really heavy. So that's the problem with the tumbler style. If you don't make a lot of compost, it could still work and be easier for you. But if, for me, a 5-pound bag of coffee, 10 pounds of carrots, I mean, it gets heavy in a hurry. And then the water and the straw and the hay and pine needles, they get heavy. And so it becomes very difficult to turn. The idea was you could just lay it on its side and give it a kick. Well, they don't budge. And the other thing is, if you live at the top of a hill and you get it started rolling and you let go of it, your neighbors may not be happy when you're bowling a bowling ball like thing comes through their yard. So examples of homemade bins, there's a few pictures which you'll get on your email. One is made out of pallets, 4 pallets just zip tied together or wired together. One is made out of wire, like livestock fencing, and one is made out of bricks. None of those show a cover. It's funny when you see compost bins other places, they're not covered. In Flagstaff, you got to cover them because everything dries out really fast. And then once it gets dried out, then you get a monsoon and it's soaked way too much water. So you really do need to keep it covered here, poke holes in whatever you cover it with. That's kind of why I ended up going with bins. I used to do piles all the time. Well, and that's another problem with doing piles in this day and age. I don't know what part of town you live in, but I'm on the east side, fairly south, and we've been invaded by javelinas. They've been in Kachina for a while. They've gradually moved up. The neighbors up the hill from me are having a terrible time. I'm starting to have a terrible time. One of the things they like to do is to turn over compost bins. And so I now have my compost bin held down with compression straps. And so they can't turn it over. And if you had a pile, and I did have some piles, and they pushed the tarp off and got underneath that too. But I think they only care for fresh, they smell the fresh vegetables or something fresh organic matter in there, maybe the hay. Once everything is broken down pretty much and you're curing, they don't seem to bother it. Or they don't bother it very much. They might check it out, but they don't. But that's one issue. So bin composting versus pile composting. I think pile composting has become more difficult with the advent of the javelinas. And I had raccoons before, and porcupines, and deer, and elk, and none of them bothered the compost. Though I did leave a bag of compressed hay because I just forgot to cover it. I was keeping it under a wheelbarrow. I forgot to cover it, and the whole thing was gone. There's nothing but a little dust on the ground. So I'm imagining a buck stuck their head in this bag, was eating the hay, got it stuck on their antlers, and it was running around the yard. Well, would have been worth the $18 to see that but never found the bag. So bins are more attractive. They are more expensive up front, but like I say, that one's been 20 years. And actually, I think it might have been free on Earth Day in those days. Sort of like they give away water recycling containers now. I think you get better airflow. You can poke holes and stuff in a pile, in the cover on the pile, and you can put a vent in it and stuff. But I still think the bins get better airflow. It's open on the bottom, so it's exposed to the earth. Piles, of course, are also open on the bottom. In the winter, piles have the advantage of more contact with the earth because they're more low profile. And I didn't have any problem with my compost freezing this year. I have other years. Sometimes I cover it with an extra layer. It's more labor intensive to turn compost in a bin because you got to pick it up. Oh, you pick one of those bins again. So we'll show you how to turn. Most of you probably already know this trick, but so you got this thing full of compost and you want to turn it. You just pick the whole thing up, move it 3 feet to one side. Well, that's pick it up higher than that. Yeah, and then you shovel it back into the bin. So it gets turned, and you know it's the other method would be, you know, well, you can't turn inside the bin. I hurt my shoulder doing that. Another thing is you have to move it twice. But yeah, you just pick the whole bin up, and then shovel it into the bin, and that gets a good turn and mixes everything with air, and it really fluffs up every time you turn it, so it increases airflow that way. Piles are kind of easy to turn the way you uncover them. You can rake the compost to one side and then rake it back, so you don't have to lift it up and over like you do with the bin.
I was just saying how foolish I feel because I've been hand turning, getting in there and turning it by hand, but that's such an easy process.
My master gardener class on composting, I felt just like you do now. I was like, oh, I mean, I literally was hurting my shoulders trying to turn it with a pitchfork, and then this person showed me that, and I'm like, oh, I feel kind of silly.
I was certainly ready for a beer after I did that.
Yeah, and a bath, probably too. So proper ventilation. So we talked about the bin, we talked about what we're going to put in. What are we going to do for proper ventilation? We have the good vents, and then we use vent pipes. And you don't necessarily, this is a 2-inch PVC pipe, which now is about $15. They used to be a lot less than that. I was using 3-inch. 3-inch is now over $30. It's more than double the 2-inch. And I drilled holes in it with a 1/2-inch bit. I had this fixture laying around. If I didn't have the fixture, I would probably just so when you're turning it, you don't want to fill the thing up with compost. So that's what the fixture's for. And if I didn't have that, I'd probably put like a yogurt container on to keep it from filling up. And if you do get stuff in it, you can just kind of wiggle it around, pull it out, dump the stuff out. But vent pipes are super important. It's funny, it's not in the Master Gardener Handbook, which I was kind of surprised because I already knew about it. But then I had this presentation where this guy made this super composter. And what did he do? He put like 5 vent pipes in the middle of his composter. And he was trying to kill E. coli. He had some, if cows are fed corn, they tend to develop E. coli, and that passes through the digestive system. So he's trying to process this manure and kill off the E. coli. And some microorganisms will eat E. coli. And so anyway, that's what he did. He had 5, and I think what I'm going to probably do now is go with about 3. And that's why I went down to the 2-inch, because I could afford that. And you could even probably use 1.5-inch. But you're just getting more air inside the compost, and that can really help to heat it up.
So what pipe per bin?
I have been doing 1 pipe per bin. I'm going to go to 2 or 3, I think. And if you've had trouble heating it up, I think that would be a good way to go. But even if you start with 1 and see how it works. Loose ingredients, straw and hay, they call it porosity. Air holes in the compost that allow more airflow to get through. And turning compost is one of the best ways to get more air to it. Proper moisture. Yes, composting actually takes place in the thin layer of water that is surrounding each piece of organic matter inside. So having enough moisture to coat each piece without soaking each piece. And it's, what you don't want to have happen is for the water to fill all the gaps so that the air can't get through. And that's not very likely here. And the good thing about the thing being open on the bottom is that the water can flow all the way through. So, you know, most of the time, you know, you put in a layer and you pour some water in, or you put in a couple layers, and then it will drain through. And so that works pretty well. For this compost pile I'm going to make here in a minute, I pre-wet a lot of the ingredients. So put them in a 5-gallon bucket, put some water on it, pull them out. So they have a chance to soak it up, because all of these ingredients tend to repel the water at first. And most likely, your compost pile gets too dry, not too wet here. Or it gets too wet for a day or so and then it dries out. Monitoring your temperature with the thermometer or just touching it with your hand. If you do get it to heat up, curing is really helpful. What I do is spread it out. I cover it with straw or burlap, and that allows the moisture to slowly let it to dry a little bit slowly. You don't want to over dry it, because then that would make it hard for the microorganisms to survive. But if you don't dry it at all, you can't strain it because it's just too clumpy, too sticky. And basically you want to let then, and if you could add worms at that point, or if you have a place to cure it where there are a lot of earthworms. I have one of my piles that's curing. I put on a bed from last year that had a lot of worms in it, and they're having a field day. And so then, once you think it's done and you're good to test it in the Ziploc bag, you can probably pass this around at this point. Make sure that the fresh nitrogen has all been used up, and then straining it. And you know, you'll get rid of some sticks and rocks. If you do pine needles, there'll be a few whole pine needles that got through the grinding process, and that's helpful. I'm going to. So let's talk a little bit about problems. It seems like the main problem people talked about was the not getting hot. And adding high nitrogen greens is probably going to help more than anything. Turning it more often will certainly help. Want to make sure it's wet enough, which is likely to be a problem here, and making sure there's plenty of airflow, because the microorganisms can't survive if there's not enough air. They can't do their thing. And in the winter, it's certainly more challenging. I had a few thoughts about the winter, and make sure it's in a sunny spot, make sure it's in good contact with the ground, double cover it, putting a tarp even over a bin like that is helpful. Add warm water. I have a trash can full of water next to my compost bin. In the winter I have to break the ice to get water. So if you're having trouble heating it up, ice water is not going to help much. So, you know, get hot water, warm water, not too hot, you don't want to cook your microorganisms, but warm water to help from inside the house. And more, you know, you don't have to do the 2-to-1 brown to green. There are, you know, I worked with some people from Washington State, and they talked about doing 1-to-1. I think if the one part of your green is alfalfa hay, that could still work because it's going to help keep things fluffy. But if you're having trouble heating it up, I would start breaking a few rules and trying, just experiment, you know, going much higher on the greens and a little lower on the browns, and monitoring what kind of browns you use so they're not too high in carbon. The wood chips, though high in carbon, break down really slowly. Okay, so let's build this compost pile. What time are we at, Nancy?
We are at 10:53.
Wow, this might be
Fast.
After the class, you can come up here if you want, and we will talk about vermiculture, unless people want to stick around. I don't have anywhere to go, and I don't think Warner's has anything for a few hours, but they do have another demo coming. Oh, and don't know why I'm getting the microphone.
No, it's good, because
I need all that stuff,
I can
yes.
hear you stuff.
So this is a short
You
vent
can
pipe.
hear it, I'm sure.
I will forget. I need, yes, whole thing, whole thing.
What's in there right now?
What's that?
What's in there right now?
Oh, this is straw that I wet earlier, and this is my attempt at a short vent pipe. I'm gonna put down hay next. I'll tell you something about I do with hay. It's funny, wet hay smells remarkably like manure. I don't know why that is.
Where do you get straw?
I do tractors. This is coffee, and it's a little moldy actually, but it still smells like coffee. But we need to do a little bit of pine straw. Oh, here it is. And so we have two greens, and the reason I did two greens is because they kind of mix them together. And I'll do that a lot. I'll do hay and vegetables, and coffee grounds and hay, and then we're gonna do some pine straw. Oh, I haven't done the special considerations for pine straw. The main thing about pine straw is it has a almost waterproof cuticle on the outside.
How did you break that down?
I run over with a lawnmower
On our driveway.
on the driveway 3 or 4 times probably.
You gotta wear a mask, dust, it's a mess.
Or you can buy a shredder or a wood chipper. They all work. So then our next green is going to be some vegetable matter and some shredded carrots. When you're at the food bank picking up a few hundred pounds and you find something that's already shredded, it's kind of like winning the lottery. Like, oh, cool, that's one thing I don't have to chop. The next thing I'm going to do is some wood chips. We have a dead tree in our yard, so these are really well-aged wood chips. So they'll break down okay. And that was not something I was doing until having a few classes this last year on regenerative soil and the advantages of woody products.
Question
Yes.
there first.
How about bark?
Yeah, I think bark's okay. I don't know for sure, but I think so. Any woody material I think is probably fine. And
What
this
about
is
pine cones to help induce aeration of the mass?
They won't probably break down. You'll probably end up taking them out. I do run over some pine cones with my lawnmower because I'm too lazy to bend over and pick them up. But so some pine cones go into my compost. But yeah, it could work. I don't know. It's not a bad idea. Do we have that water in here?
What do you consider a well-aged wood chip?
This tree was dead when I moved in 28 years ago. It fell over about 20 years ago. And I actually chopped the wood chips off with a pickaxe, not an axe. It's that soft, yeah. This was some compost from a previous batch. So it should have lots of good microorganisms in it. And then we will, what else? Oh, this is actually not grass. It's winter wheat that I grow as a cover crop. We'll put some of that in there. We'll go back to some more straw. I always start with a brown and end with a brown. I don't know if that's just my sense of balance or, but it seems to, my theory is that it keeps it from getting, so the pine needles have this cuticle. If you break them up some way, and you can run over them with a car, you can use a lawnmower, you can use a mulcher, you can use a chipper, and that breaks them up. And then I put them in a 5-gallon bucket and I soak them for 3 days. And during that time, they start to expand a little bit. You get a little white on the end where they've absorbed some water. And then they compost pretty much like anything else. If you do whole pine needles, and I have experimented with doing whole pine needles, I soaked them for like 2 weeks. And then they did compost, but they didn't break down. They were still whole pine needles until I put them through the strainer, and then they crumbled. And it still will take several months, much longer. So typically with my compost, not true in the winter. In the winter, you know, I pretty much try to get some compost started, get it heated up, and then I don't worry too much about it, you know, if it cools down because of the cold weather and stuff. And when I have a chance, I turn it. This winter I traveled for a couple weeks. I came back, it snowed every day or it was cold, and I didn't turn it, and then I traveled again. And so, you know, it went a long time sometimes. But it still broke down pretty well, and then when I did get back to a decent weather, I turned it. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Old pine needles from old duck that are pretty much shredded down. You want to, it's too small, the such thing is too small.
Oh, grinding them up too small?
Well, if they've already kind of halfway broken down and you send them through your package screen, is that a good thing to add, or is it better just leave them on the ground? Because you know, you can build up as much pine needles as that, right?
Yeah, see, I don't, you know, permaculture people, even in Flagstaff, talk about leaving them on the ground I don't think that's a good idea in Flagstaff. I think it's okay in South Carolina, where you're more likely to have floods. And here, where we're likely to have a fire, if you have a fire in your neighborhood and you have a bunch of pine needles stacked up, then, you know, it's going to just make, I mean, much more likely that you're going to lose your house.
I rate nothing, but I don't put on all the dirt, because I think you need some of that.
Yeah, a little bit's probably okay. And they do make a nutritious duff, you know, but I think it's just too dangerous. I rake them up and I put them on my beds for the winter, where there's less fire danger and my beds are separated, you know, by walkways and stuff. And then I compost them mostly in the spring, and aging them is also supposed to help them to break down, so they get 6 months of age that way. If you've got a, yeah, I think we're on the same page. Oh, people say pine needles are acidic. It's kind of the same with all organic matter. When it breaks down and dries out, it becomes neutral. And so green pine needles have a pH of like 3.5, which is very acidic. But once they've turned brown, they're pretty much neutral. And when I worked with these people in Washington State, they did, they tested their compost made with pine needles, and it was like a 6.5, so basically neutral. So it's not really a problem, and especially since we have alkaline soil, you're not likely to create a problem using pine needles. There's a lot of things on the internet, don't use more than 10%. You don't have to worry about that. But I tell you, it's really satisfying when you look at your neighbor and there's like this huge pile of bags of pine needles and you don't have any because you composted yours. And so I think it's really a satisfying thing to be able to recycle those pine needles. And that's another, you know, permaculture idea, is that you want to utilize what you have. Yes, ma'am.
If you use, well, I use pine needles for fire starters in my fireplace.
Uh-huh.
And then that kind of from the pine and whatever. Is that wood ash okay, sort of, in small amounts?
I think wood ash is okay. It's just like the eggshells, you're adding some alkalinity. But if you're okay with that, I mean, you can compensate with soil sulfur or more organic matter. But I think it's okay, yeah. Yes.
Is ash from pellets the same as wood ash? Do you have a pellet burning?
I don't know myself, but my guess is that they have to use something to glue the pellets together. Same, I mean, they say no charcoal briquettes for that reason, because they have to glue them together, and then that adds some bad things. I don't know for sure. I'm sure there's people on the internet that would be happy to discuss it with you and, and give you all sides of the story. Sorry. Other questions?
What tools for testing pile do you recommend besides that temperature?
Well, smelling it. I have not really ever, I have a soil test kit, but I haven't ever tried to test the compost. I don't know, I think they say it's more difficult to do a soil test kit with organic matter. You know, and so I think you would probably, if you really wanted to know what was in there, you should maybe think about sending it off to, I think Texas A&M, their extension I think is pretty reasonable.
I was referring more to the process of knowing when it's ready to go to the next step or whether.
Oh, yeah, it's kind of intuition, I think. You know, nothing, almost nothing recognizable. I mean, there could be some things that survive the composting process. Like, I got some carrots at the food bank that were as big around as my wrist, and those things didn't compost very well, so I ended up picking, straining those out. They never broke down very well.
And you can see the bag that we sent around, you can see little bits of pine needle in there, but you're not seeing tomatoes, you're not seeing eggshells, you're not seeing other stuff. It's broken down. And but that last part of letting it sit and then putting it through a sifter, we think is pretty important. I mean,
Then one other question.
Sure.
You talked about the drainage of the water to keep the moisture content correct in there. Would that water carrying the nutrients that's in it be valuable to putting it into your plants instead of just letting it drain into the ground?
Well, that's a good question. For a long time, I put my compost piles on top of one of my beds, and so that the water was running down. Now, some people would say that's, not completely composted, so maybe it would have something bad in it. But I don't use anything but vegetables and straw and hay, so I don't think there's anything bad. So yes, the ground underneath my compost bin is always super nutritious. We actually go back and harvest that soil. We'll like maybe do multiple compost bins in this one area, and then we'll, dig up that soil and strain the rocks out and put it in beds. It becomes super nutritious. Several of my beds are where I used to have compost bins. No, it's a good point. Yes.
How do you attach the pipes to your bin?
Oh, I just like this. They're just held up by the stuff that's inside. They're not.
If the lid is
Well, I haven't tested this. I just cut this one the other day. So in theory, it still fits.
it's not way up the
Well, the people the guy that I was talking about that trying to make this super composter, he didn't have a lid, but like I said, in Flagstaff, that's going to be a problem. You could cut a hole in the lid and put your pipe through there, but one of the problems in the winter, I want the air from inside the compost bin to be going into the bin, because otherwise I don't want to be taking cold air down into the bin. But I haven't really had a problem with it. But it's a good point. But yeah, like I said, the one that I saw had it didn't have a top on it. It had 5 different things coming out of it, and you didn't cover it at all. Yes, ma'am.
I have that bin and I empty. I have 2 bins like that. One I emptied. I'm starting the new one now. So I have a lot of green from vegetable matter. So when I fill it in there, should I have a layer before I add some of the straw or the ground?
I put straw on the bottom, and I don't know, that's not scientific it's sort of been I figure that the greens are wetter, that liquid is going to, as they break down, are soaking down into the straw, and the straw is going to absorb some of that liquid so it doesn't just go into the ground.
But I'm always adding green to it, so I just don't know when I should add brown. When it's all spread out evenly in the bottom, and put the brown in.
Well, usually I think people say do 1 inch of brown and 2 inches of green and then another inch of brown.
Okay.
The better you have it layered, the less likely you're going to go anaerobic, and it also helps with airflow.
So,
Hi, Hattie. Yes.
so if you need more brown, you could add things like newspapers or cardboard.
Yep.
Or straw, right?
Yep.
Okay. Instead of going out and buying a bale of straw or something, there are other things you can use like that, right? That you tend to have around.
Yep. You can certainly do that. Yep. I just fell in love with using straw.
And you buy weed-free straw.
Yep, the stuff at Tractor Supply, compressed straw, is marked weed-free. Same with the hay. Yep, I had a guy tell me that he used a bunch of straw for mulch from Olson's and ended up with a whole layer of weeds. I have never had that happen, but yes, sir.
You talked about the coffee grounds in there. Have you ever used any of the chaff, the byproducts from the roasting of the coffee?
I have been thinking about working on that. I think that's a brown,
It is a brown.
and it's a woody brown.
And it's really thin skin. It's almost a material like from popcorn when you
Wow.
popcorn, but it's super soft. So
Wow.
it's cellular structure could break down very quickly.
Where do you get it from?
My wife.
Oh. Because I was thinking about going to Fire Creek. I know the owner there, and they roast, and I think probably have bags of it.
We have probably 50 cubic feet of it in the shop right now.
What shop?
Ponderosa roasting.
Oh, wow. Can I get some from you?
Sure.
Yeah. Good.
There you go.
You want to brew beer?
Been involved in processing the sugars and stuff like that in the coffee roaster to develop IPAs and such already.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah, I'm into beer.
Oh, good. Yes.
One more. So starting a bid like that, the idea is that it's not really working until it's full, right?
Oh, no, that's not true.
Okay.
It'll start working. If you layer browns and greens, and get it up to about a third, then it'll start, or whatever, it'll start working. And, as we get into warmer and more sun, then it's going to work that much better, even though it's a smaller amount. But you may need to turn it more often because it doesn't have enough mass to sort of insulate itself.
Okay. So then that does make sense because ideally you're adding food each week
Yep.
from your kitchen. It continues to fill you up, so it's not that you have to have it all full from the beginning.
No, I was at this seminar and this woman's like, you need to save all your stuff and add it in at once. And I'm like, that's not practical for household people because, you just don't produce that much, so, but it is, it's okay for me because I go scavenging and I get coffee and I get vegetable matter from other places. But yeah, it's not practical to try to fill the thing at once. It will start cooking if you got the moisture and everything right.
How often do you empty, empty it over? Use it? How long does it take for usually?
To make a batch of compost?
Yeah, in that.
When I was really concerned about trying to keep it really hot, I thought I could get a batch done, kind of cooked in a month and another month of curing. But I'm not trying to do that anymore. I think it makes more sense to take 2 to 3 months and then a month of curing. If you can do it in 2 or 3 months, I think that's pretty good. If it takes 6 months, that's okay too. And if you have to buy some organic matter in the meantime, while it's cooking, then, when you get it done and you add the fresh compost, that organic matter that you purchased you're going to add some microorganisms to help consume that.
So real briefly on worms?
So, do you guys want to hear about worms? We're over time,
Yes.
Real briefly.
but I'm not being paid by the hour, so. Whoops. We'll have to bring it over here, Nancy.
Oh, okay.
I will trade with you one compost pile. Oh,
Frank, I don't think you need to keep this on. Why don't you just take it off? It's just,
Move.
thank you.
Might be easier for people just to come up and.
you guys want to just come up and look, and we won't social distance.
If you can leave it so the camera is able to get a video, sorry.
And then you guys can all come up and look. There's nothing to look at now, but there's thousands of worms in here. Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have 4 of these at home, and this is really, really interesting. It's important to have holes on the bottom. That amount of moisture has seeped out since we got here
thank you.
this morning.
Thank you. Yeah, that's what I do to say.
And Frank builds the bins with, go ahead.
Well, so they're oxygen loving just like us. They need oxygen. So you drill holes in the top. I don't make them quite that big anymore, but and then I put some tiny little holes on the side, and that's to allow carbon dioxide to escape. And then I drilled holes in the bottom, which allows it to drain. And we start off with a layer of sand. I've never heard of anyone else doing that, but the sand keeps the worms from going down to the bottom and escaping from the holes. They'll sometimes get in the sand, but they don't usually ever go through it. Some people say you put a layer of dirt. You know, worms don't have teeth and they grind their food, so they need some grit. It seems like the sand works fine for them. So, and then we use core fiber, which they sell here now, which I'm really happy about because it's really hard to get into the marijuana growing place. This is pretty good texture. I was just reading, and the amount of moisture, they're talking about 90% moisture content. I'm like, I don't know what that means. It sounds like it'd be floating, but they do get much wetter. If you start it off at a damp level, you put worms and food in there, it does get really wet. It gets pretty wet in a fairly short amount of time. The drain holes really help. I had one the other day that I didn't drill big enough holes, and it got really wet. And so worms eat, you know, kitchen scraps. They like fruit, they like lettuce, they like spinach. They don't much like cabbage products. They don't like onions much. They don't do garlic, mushrooms, potatoes. Other people have told me in classes that their worms did eat that other stuff. Maybe that's because that's all they gave them, and they're like, okay, fine. It's kind of like kids, I guess. We pretty much do lettuce, and we nuke it for a little bit because it makes it easier for them to eat it very quickly.
Like those slimy lettuce.
They have to break little bits off, and they can't break off a hard piece of lettuce even. I had notes. I should probably.
So this bin, I take and I dig down like this, and then I put in some lettuce. Each bin probably gets one head of lettuce. I fed these guys about 3 days ago, and it's almost all gone. So I use probably 4 heads of lettuce every 7 to 8 days. And I put some in there, and then I cover it, and then I go here, and you can still see there's some lettuce. There's tons and tons of worms in here. They don't like the light, so if we were to let this sit for 5 minutes, all those worms that you see right now, you wouldn't be able to see anymore. They crawl right down. And it takes us about, this bin was started about a month or so ago. It takes maybe 3 or 4 months for them to create the worm castings. And Frank always tells me that not to worry, they'll just eat their bedding if they don't have any food. And then we cover this up because they really don't like the light, and then we have a cover on the top.
That compensates for the light that would get through the air holes.
And then they'll eat this paper.
And lay eggs on it. Yes.
So the liquid that leaks out the bottom, is that full of really good stuff or bad stuff?
Yes and no.
Potentially has bad stuff.
Okay.
What it's considered is that it is it's not completely composted.
Okay.
Now, I don't probably have it, just feed them lettuce and stuff, so probably don't have a lot of bad stuff. Some people put their worms in manure, so then you'd have more bad stuff. But what I would say to do with that liquid, it's not worm tea. You make worm tea by taking worm castings, putting it in a bucket with an aerator, and letting it bubble, and so you're creating aerobic bacteria. But what you could do with this stuff, since it's just not completely compost, pour it into your compost. It probably has a lot of good, thank you, good, bacteria and stuff that would help your compost to heat up faster.
Okay.
What is it you want to do with the worms? Is it the dirt you're getting from them that you then put in your garden?
This, if I think of compost as an amendment, I think of this as fertilizer.
And when you put it in, the worms are going to go with it?
Nope.
No, I harvest
We harvest the
all
worms.
these thousands of worms into a new bin, and then we come up with worm castings.
How do you get out of the dirt? It seems tedious.
So this is a commercial worm cafe, but we have a bin that we put on top of this that has holes in it. We put fresh bedding and put all the food in this upper, we call it an upper apartment or upper tier, and they move up. I was surprised that I could build one and it would work. This one is a commercial one, so you'd have your worms in the bottom, you put fresh bedding in the next layer, and gradually they would move all the way up, and then you just have completely clean bedding on the bottom.
What size holes on the bottom when do you want them to migrate in?
Mine are like 1/2 inch. I don't know how big these are. They have to be at least 1/4 inch, I think, for the worm to get through. But I did mine like 1/2 inch because I was afraid they wouldn't go through.
And is that upper one resting on the?
On the dirt.
Right on
So
the,
they
right on,
they can just migrate up.
it has to be in contact with the dirt so they can move up.
Right.
They don't jump.
Even if they stood up.
They will crawl vertical, yeah,
We
they
call
will
them
escape.
escapees.
And so, I mean, yeah, and so we put an upper tier on it. That will usually get most of them to come up. And then Nancy is very cautious about going through them with a fork and picking up the last few worms. There is this system, so it shows the upper tier here. This is our upper tier. Same den, fits exactly, so they can't escape around it. And then this is called the volcano. The volcano method. So you make these piles and you put a light on it, and then they don't like the light, so they crawl down. And then you scoop the worm castings off the top, and then you make more piles, and they keep going down. And then eventually you do have to pick some out, or you could just take those remaining worms and add them into a new bin with the castings. So we don't really make castings exactly. We make because it takes like 6 months for them to eat all of their bedding, and it gets really wet and smelly. So we call it worm compost. So we, go about 3 months, 2 to 3 months, and so there's still a good bit of core fiber in there. The core fiber is a good thing for your plants too, and so it's core fiber mixed with a lot of worm castings. And that just works for us. It seemed like just letting it go. I've seen pictures on the internet where there's just that whole bin's full of worms and castings, and it's just like, man, it's got to be really wet and nasty. And the less bedding there is, the more they try to escape. So
these are worm castings that we harvested in February, and we haven't put them out around our plants and dug them in yet. And I'm just looking through here. I got them out of a 5-gallon bucket this morning. I got this, and I can see some little teeny worms in there. So it takes me usually to harvest this with the volcano method, which is what I do. First of all, I come in here and I take them like this, and I go, oh, there's a pile of worms, there's a pile of worms, and I throw them into my new bin. So I get rid of hundreds of them that way. And then I do the volcano method, and then it takes me about 2 hours to get all those worms out. And I really, they don't like the cold, and they're fine. They're fine. They've been living in this stuff in the garage for 2 months now. So
Nancy treats them like our cat.
Those worm castings look like dirt.
Yeah,
What?
really good dirt.
it's basically this is basically their poop, what they've pooped out,
Worm poop.
I guess.
Yes.
Well, is that the same thing as that? Minus
No,
the
but this
worms?
has only been 1
This is
month.
not very old.
This
probably
was 4 months
had worms in
in.
it for a couple months. And the worm castings, it continues to compost outside of the worms. So they eat it and they poop it out, and when they do, they add some enzymes and some microorganisms to it. And then while it's sitting up, it's dangerous around here. And these things are deadly, right? So it continues to compost after the worms have, So this probably has become more refined in the month or so it's been sitting in the garage. Anybody else will look at it? And it smells really good. Very, almost no smell at all.
Nancy, are they reproducing in there? So
Yes.
you're-
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
That's my true lack of biological knowledge. I apparently didn't pay attention in junior high. But it seems like, we have a very elementary version of what you have. It does seem like, if you end up with some in your garden and some other places.
It's not going to hurt.
Yeah.
And
Well,
if it gets too cold, they'll just die.
They say these worms can't live outside, but if they've got enough organic matter and the soil's soft enough that they can dive down deep, I've had them survive
Seems
in
like
my
they have
compost
it.
pile and
Yeah.
in my bed.
Okay.
Yeah.
You probably said this, but where do you keep your worms as far as temperature?
In the summer, we have them in the garage. They like the dark. And in the winter, we have them in one of our bathrooms.
Okay.
We have 4 bins like this.
Some at the farmer's market sells it too, if anyone's looking to buy
Oh,
it.
okay.
I buy it at the farmer's market. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
You buy the worm castings?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Cast-
Do they sell
not the
worms
worms?
too?
And not that I've seen. I just buy the little Ziploc bag like that for $5 or something.
There used to be a guy that I talked to a bunch about worms, and I imagine if you asked him, he would bring you a pound of worms.
And they sell the worms here. We've never been able to sell them because we can't figure out, they sell worms, not worms like that. So,
My compost has worms almost by the millions. I'm grabbing
well,
handfuls.
and those are probably earthworms.
Yeah, these are red wigglers.
Oh, okay.
So, the difference is that earthworms, well, they eat compost, but they kind of live in soil, and they eat soil. Red wigglers just eat organic matter. They don't eat soil. So, they're a little less adaptable, and earthworms have a wild spirit. They don't really like being domesticated much. So, it's a little more challenging to keep them alive inside. But if you've got all those worms in your compost, that's great.
Yeah.
It makes it very difficult to strain.
It does.
Have you mixed them?
Earthworms, and well, I'm sure I have, yeah. I don't know, I just, because I know some red wigglers get into my compost, and there's some earthworms in there. So I wondered about that too. I did want to put all my red wigglers outside for the summer. I went to Europe, and I had this huge cardboard box, bigger than a table, filled it full of compost, put all my worms in it, and they ate, and a bunch of food on top, and they ate the food, they ate the compost, then they ate the box. And so I'm sure there was some interaction there, but earthworms coming up. And then I was able to recapture a lot of them and take them back inside. But yeah, I'm sure there's been some mix. I don't know how that works. I don't know. I don't think they fight. I think they probably just eat each other's food. And yeah,
You
I don't
were
know.
talking about the out east. What is the soil like in Donny Park? What would I do?
Alkaline.
Yeah, but it seems to me like it's very sandy, so it's like it's not going to hold a lot.
If you're in the sandy area, then yes, then you have to add a lot of organic matter to it. I think you might want to buy, if it's really sandy, you can go to Landscape Connection and buy some, well, it's also from Donny Park. It's old from the old bean farms in the 30s, but it's more of a silt. It would at least be a little bit better for retaining moisture than.
Wouldn't that still wash out with the rains? Just wash through the sandy soil?
Well, maybe.
I was told that they don't even put a well out there because it's so sandy you have to drill 10,000 feet just to get the water.
Do
Yeah.
containers. That's what I do out in Donny Park.
You did what?
I have containers.
Yeah.
I'm not by the.
Or raised beds and put a layer of wood on the bottom of the raised bed. There is, and this is actually on the internet. Last year we did beginner gardening classes on the internet, and Gail Graytop taught a class in Page, and I kidded that it was how to go on sand. And she, yeah, that was, so that is still on the internet, I'm sure.
No, when you call, I'll get it from you.
Okay. I know ours in this county, ours are, I imagine the ones from Page are still on the internet too. So I'll ask Gail and make sure I can find out where it's at.
Thank you.
But yeah, that would be a good tip. I don't have sand, I have silt and limestone. And, you know, it's bad on its own, for its own reasons, but it's not as bad as for sand. Yeah, we can do that. It's the Coconino County Extension YouTube. Oh, yeah, I have to find, yes, I'm pretty